see only you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and actually it's a pleasure just because the occasion is pleasurable, but also because it's a partial payment of a very old and very large intellectual debt. About 50 years ago, in the mid-60s, I was teaching research methods at Hebrew University, and in that context I ran into an article that I found utterly fascinating. And in that article, by a person I didn't know, he had gone to Trinidad and he had asked children, and I remembered two questions. And one was, you can have a candy now or a much larger candy tomorrow, or next week it was. And the other question was, there is a magic man that can make you whatever you want to be. What do you want to be? And that question was scored 1 if you mentioned a profession, or a trait that is related to achievement, otherwise 0. And the other question also had 2 possible answers. The small reward now, the larger one tomorrow. And I was stunned. And what stunned me was that here was a new way of doing psychology. I had really not encountered that before. And I call that the psychology of single questions. There is one question, a situation, it's a yes-no answer, and as I summarized it, I was exaggerating, but I said it predicts everything in sight, because there were many correlates. It was very clear also, although there were no studies of the future, that this was the kind of test that was going to predict the future. As it turned out, it did. And that psychology of single question, you may, when one thinks of Walter Mischel, one thinks of what he has discovered, but what impressed me then was a method. And it actually changed my life, because a few years later, when Amos Tversky and so I very much wanted to do the psychology of single questions, do exactly that sort of thing. I tried to imitate Walter, and I failed. I was studying children, because that's what he had done. And then when Amos Tversky and I started working together on the psychology of judgment, we applied the psychology of single questions. Everything we did was in that method, and it turned out to be very important to us. And so very important, I think, to actually how well we did in our research program. And I've always felt that debt of gratitude to Walter. So, Walter, thank you. And how did you come up with that?
Well, I think I've always been very interested in having a methodology that's edible. I think that one of the things that troubled me enormously when I sort of stumbled into psychology was the enormous complexity of the methods that were then regnant, particularly since I came to it from clinical psychology originally, where the amount of inference and the amount of extrapolation was just overwhelming. And I really wanted to see what one can do with simple questions. And therefore, one side, really, of my work went in that direction, whereas another side of my work went in a direction that's also in the book, but that really requires the simplification of complex data, the simplification of massive data, more data than I think has been accumulated, as far as I know, in any archival study within psychology, where we got something like 160 hours of observation per child on a sample of about 85 children, studied for 6 weeks very intensively in a summer camp in order to really get at a completely different question that's actually connected to the simple one, which is what's the structure and organization of behavior? What's the consistency or inconsistency in which we express our dispositions? So I think both sides are important.
Actually, even the complex studies lend themselves to very neat summaries. I mean, that seems to be a characteristic of your work. I had a question that's irrelevant to anything. Was being a fireman did that count as a profession?
Yes.
Okay.
Being a fireman,
I had wanted to know that.
absolutely. A profession is anything. I mean, there
Just
was
being
no
engaged in work.
evaluation. It's some form of work.
Interesting. Well, so this changed psychology, I think, in multiple ways, but the method was certainly a major contribution here. What did you make of the discovery that you made then, and how have your views changed? What really put yourself where you were 50 years ago? Actually, yeah, more than 50 years ago. Where were you?
Well, I was young. But in addition to that, I was realizing that I had bitten just a tiny piece of the question that really interested me. The piece that I had gotten a hold of was the choice. Do you want a little candy now or a big one later? Do you want $1 now or $1.10 tomorrow? And that ultimately, I think, became something that the economists have made much of in the form of intertemporal discounting. That is the question of how are delayed rewards discounted, severely discounted usually, and how does that enter into decision making, which is your bailiwick, of course. But I felt that that was only the beginning of the question, because for me, the challenge is that when I go into a restaurant, I have made the decision, no dessert tonight. And I have frequently experienced the decay of that decision. So that when the dessert tray arrives, the chocolate mousse that I had resolved to stay away from winds up in the mouth. So that question became enormously interesting to me, of what happens after one has chosen and actually has to do the foregoing. And the marshmallow test is different from the method that you described, in the sense that it begins with the choice, so that every child in the situation with the 3 marshmallows, or doesn't have to be marshmallows, fortunately, can be whatever the child picks from a selection of goodies that are available. It can be little pretzels and so on.
You should describe the situation.
Yeah, let me describe it, because it's very poorly described in the media, in the sense that even the marshmallows, including the marshmallows on the cover of my book, are not like the marshmallows we used. The marshmallows we used were very tiny little marshmallows. They were really these miniature things that are like 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 an inch at the most. They're very, very tiny. And the other alternatives were things like tiny little thin stick pretzels, 1 versus 2, or even poker chips, shiny poker chips, 2 colored ones or 1. So it doesn't even have to be something that you can stick in your mouth and eat. It's a choice that you've made as a 4-year-old or a 3.5-year-old, as a 5-year-old, that you'd rather have the 2 than the 1 of whatever it is that's attracted you from this pile of goodies that you've chosen from. Having made the choice, the question becomes, how long do you wait? And most important, what are the conditions that you yourself create that makes it either impossible for you to wait or easy for you to wait? Because what my burning question was, to try to understand how my 3 daughters, who were 4, 5, and 6, or 3, 4, and 5, depending on which part of the research we're talking about, managed to go in just a few years from really being the way Freud described the infant, namely highly impulse-driven, to becoming rational human beings that one could have an interesting conversation with and who were able to do all kinds of things, including to delay gratification and give themselves self-instructions. And I didn't have a clue about what was going on in their heads that made that possible, other than from conversations with them at the kitchen table. And my burning goal really became to understand what goes on in mind and in behavior. There was no talk or way of even thinking about the brain at that time, although that entered into the work in the years since then, to try to figure out how does this work. And I don't have films with me, and I can't show them to you, but if you were to see the videos,
I recommend it.
yeah, it is amazing what one can learn from 10 minutes of watching kids do this procedure, because one sees...
You haven't told people here about the bell. Yeah,
okay.
I think the
so
procedure...
the procedure is very, very simple. In the introduction it was described that there's whatever it is that's the goodie. So you're the child, and there's that you've picked, let's say, marshmallows, okay? So you have 2 here, and you have 1 here, and they're in front of you on a tray. And you have a bell right over here also. And you're sitting facing the thing directly, and you're in a little waiting square that you can't get out of. We've already played a lot of games so that you trust me, and you know me because I've been hanging around in the nursery school and so on, if I'm the researcher. And you have practiced as the first thing after we finish playing the games and put the games away and so on. So there's no trust issue. You trust me. On top of it, you have all the goodies here. So there's no question of, will I get the marshmallows? They're already there. And then there's this bell, which is the bring me back bell. And I explained to you, this is the bring me back bell. Every time you ring it, I come back into the room. And then I jump out of the room, you ring the bell, and I say, okay, ring the bell again. We go through this 3 or 4 or 5 times. Very enjoyable if you're 4 years old. So the rapport has now been established, okay? And you're ready to go. You've made your choice, you want the 2, and then I go away, and you're by yourself. And if you are...
And there is a rule. I know that if I call you before you come on your own...
Yes, the rule is that now if what you have to do, if you don't want to go on waiting, is you either can start eating the 1 marshmallow, which is fine, or you can ring the bell and bring me back. But you can't get out of the chair, and you can't start eating the marshmallow unless you realize that when you start eating the marshmallow, it's over, okay?
You're not going to get the 2.
You're not going to get the 2, okay? That's the situation. That's the whole thing. And the question then becomes, how long do you wait by seconds, and what do you do while you're waiting? Because in later studies, we began to realize we could learn an enormous amount from watching the child's eye movements. Are they looking at the goodies? Are they looking at the bell, which would be looking at the hot stimuli in the situation? Or are they turning around, turning away in order to not see it? Are they pushing it carefully to the end of the table so it's as far from them as possible? Are they starting to talk to themselves and giving themselves instructions, which are very cute when they do it? Are they starting to pick their ears or the nasal cavities and toying with the products? Are they, since it's California, tossing off their sandals and playing piano on their toes? So what one sees is an enormous repertoire of attention control shifting that captures, I think, what is now called executive function or executive control, an enormously important concept currently in studying self-control and in cognitive neuroscience. So what's executive function or executive control? You have to keep a goal in mind. I want the 2 marshmallows. You have to prevent and inhibit interfering responses, for example, like ringing the bell or thinking about ringing the bell, which will get you to ring the bell, or starting to think about the hot qualities, how yummy and chewy and sweet the goodie will taste. Those are the things you have to inhibit. And you have to use your attention control areas to shift around and monitor your progress and do whatever it takes to be able to get to the two marshmallows. That's the essence of executive control, of executive function. And that's fundamentally the description of the situation.
I didn't know, I started out by telling you that I didn't know Walter. In fact, I think I first met you in 1977, probably. But later, in the 1960s, you wrote a book that was, in a way, a scandal. It was an enormously important and really subversive book in which many people said you destroyed the notion of personality. Not a small thing. And the idea was that normally we think of personality in terms of traits, to be honest, or to have high self-control, or to be aggressive. And you showed that this doesn't hold water because, we had already known that, but you showed us a great deal more. People are honest in some situations and not honest in others. So personality just doesn't have the structure that everybody thought it had. This was a very big deal at the time, and still is. Except that now we've all accepted it. I think we're all Mischelians, but at the time you were given a pretty hard time, I think, with that notion. And so that was, a second big deal that Walter came up with.
That was actually the first big deal. The marshmallows came much later.
Yeah, I know, but retrospectively, you were ready, and retrospectively, you had already thought of delay of gratification and of whether it is a trait or not a trait. You knew a great deal by the time you wrote your book. As I was thinking about your current book, I thought that there are 4 themes in it. I'm going to oversimplify, and that there are 2 pairs of themes, and there is some tension between them. So you have the best demonstrations that traits, as we think of them, do not exist. But you also have, I think, the best demonstration of a trait, in the sense that self-control, as you measure it in the marshmallow test, in that single question, it doesn't predict everything, because it doesn't predict that you'll always be self-controlled in every situation, but it clearly predicts a lot of things that are not at all like marshmallow eating. So you're well beyond so there is that tension between an emphasis and really a major discovery, I think, that a reconceptualization more than a discovery of what personality is, that you produced in 68. No traits as we think of them, and here is the best demonstration of a trait. And then there is a related tension, I think, between 2 other major discoveries. One is in your emphasis on situation, and you have an emphasis on change, that it is actually possible to learn and to change your behavior. This is probably the theme you love best in the book. That's what it feels like. But at the same time, you have the best demonstration we have of persistence. We have children aged 4, and it really predicts what they will be like and how obese they will be, among other things, and whether they will be using drugs or not 30 years later. Did you feel the tension, or is it only in readers' minds? Because I think many readers do feel that tension, and you've been exposed to that.
Yeah, I personally don't feel the tension at all, but I'm aware that it's felt and that there's good reason to feel it unless there's an explanation. So let me try to explain why I don't feel tension.
Good.
Because while my 68 book, which is still impressed, by the way, made the case that there is much less consistency across situations than has been assumed. That is, that the same person who is terrified in the dentist's office may be an incredibly courageous mountain climber. That the same individual who is a tremendous entrepreneur and very, very able to deal with complex decision with almost no nervousness can fall apart in social situations. So the challenge was that there is very little consistency in who we are when the contexts shift. What has been discovered since then that is very important and that resolves the dilemma is that the contextualized me remains stable over time. So there is stability over long periods of time that allow us to predict, for example, that someone who has problems, let's say, for an example, with White House interns and with junk food, but does not have problems when dealing with heads of state, is likely to have a pattern of that kind that will have temporal stability. So there's a big difference between things that are stable over time and things that are consistent across situations. Now, going back to the self-control question, which is really what we're about here tonight. Self-control to me, rather than being a personality trait, is a cognitive skill or a cognitive skill set. And cognitive skills were exempted, even in my '68 book, from vulnerability. That is, once you have a cognitive skill, you have it. Unless you develop dementia or something happens to lose it, you've got the skill. Whether or not you use it and where you use it is another question. So to me, self-control is a very good example of a human competence. And what can change are our competencies. We can change our competencies, and we can certainly change the cognitive and emotional skills that allow us to regulate our emotions, that is, where we don't have to lose our temper, even if we're readily disposed to do so, that there are ways we can control it. We don't have to ring the bell, that there are ways, if we're motivated and want to, that we can do things like those little kids are doing, that allows us to use our executive function to reach the 2 marshmallows, or to reach the goals we have, and so on. So I'm not suggesting, when I say that there's very limited consistency across different situations, I'm not suggesting that the individual is empty of personality. There's lots of personality in there, but that it is expressed in contextualized ways, and rather than being thought of as traits that you have or don't, are influenced by things like your expectations, your goals, your values, and your competency.
But there is something trait-like, surely, in when a single question like the marshmallow test predicts, obesity 30 years later. This is cross-situational. And I took a bad example with obesity, but it predicts many other things. So there is a lot of cross-situational consistency in the domain of self-control.
Because it's a skill that allows you to do lots of things that have predictive consequences. In the sense that what allows you to resist the temptation of the immediate reward is very similar to what allows you to resist the temptation of the rich dessert.
What's different about White House interns?
What's different about White House interns and junk food?
Yeah.
It's a lot different, but because the thing in which we vary, that is the way in which your personality, my personality, the personality of everybody in this room differs, is in what our hotspots are. And our hotspots may have high stability. That is, so for me to talk about self-control makes very little sense unless one is talking about self-control vis-a-vis what? Vis-a-vis which hotspots? And when I'm talking about hotspots, it takes us again to something that you do in your book, and that I do in my book, which is a very important metaphor. In your case, system 1, system 2. In my case, the idea of two systems in the mind, now in the brain. One is a limbic system that is reflexive, emotional, rapid, and that has us going very rapidly towards and away from things in a very fundamental, basic, primitive way that includes grabbing the marshmallows or grabbing the cleaning lady or the intern or the... So that's very important. But we also have a cool system, and a cool system that is essentially the prefrontal cortex, the attention control centers and so on, that enable executive function, that allow us to take the future into account and so on. So I don't think we can make precise predictions about people and where they will and won't control themselves unless we know their hotspots. And I think...
But the hotspots being areas in which the self-control fails, but...
Well, yes, exactly.
But clearly the marshmallow test would not be what it is if there were too many hotspots among those who pass it. I mean, you know, who...
Yeah, you're saying that the people who are able to, the kids who are able to do this well are showing us something very important. They're showing us that already at age 4 or 5, they have a very important competence. That they're already giving us an excellent example of executive control. On the other hand, if a child doesn't do it, you don't know what it means. And while there are two trajectories that keep being talked about for good reason, because they're the two trajectories we studied, which is people who are consistently high in self-control over the life course and people who are consistently lower in self-control over the life course. They're different. There are two other trajectories for which we haven't got the money and for which I haven't got the lifetime left to study them. Those two are kids who start low and get higher and higher over the life course, and kids who start high and get lower and lower over the life course. We really don't know what's going on there, and to me, they're the most interesting trajectories. Now, it's true, I mean, you're right, they are smaller.
It must be smaller.
They are smaller, otherwise we wouldn't be getting correlations. But the correlations themselves, I think, involve a very interesting sequence that allows us to get some sense of what is making it possible for kids to do well. And the sequence is one, if they're able to have the executive control to wait for their two goodies, okay, they're able also to keep their mouths shut long enough while the teacher is boring them in school, for example, to begin to be successful early in life in school, which in turn has its consequences. So what we're seeing, I think, are correlations that allow us to predict reasonably from being able to do it, to having a better chance to make it in school, to having a better chance to do well on the SAT, to have a better chance to keep going in that direction, and so on. So I think we know something about the sequences that allow sustained, reasonable self-control, but we know very little about the other trajectories.
So, I mean, what we're seeing here, I was wondering today about, you know, why a reader of your book, I think many readers will feel the tension, and why you feel there is no problem. And I wonder if you agree with me, with my diagnosis about, you know, what is happening here. And what seems to be happening it's in the language. We don't have a good language to talk about correlations. So the way we talk about it is we say children who delay do this later in life. They are less likely to be obese. Children who grab the marshmallow are more likely to take drugs. That sentence, children who delay will be obese, you know, that sounds like all children. You know, it's just in the language. Now, that's not what psychologists mean when they say children do this. What they mean is they are more likely to do this than children who don't.
Absolutely.
And this is just so heavy to say that we don't say it anymore.
Well, I mean, I try to say it in the book. I
But
say
you
it.
can't say it all the time because it would be intolerable.
No, my editor absolutely allowed me to say it only once.
That's right.
So, but the caveat is in there, and I think what you're saying is extremely important, because the caveat that I give in the book is a true story about a mother who also was a brilliant scientist in a very distinguished German research institute. And I had given a talk at that institute and shown the movies and so on, and received a phone call from her in distress several months after the talk saying no matter what she's tried to do with her 4-year-old, he just won't wait. And she seemed to feel that
He's doomed.
He's doomed. He's had it, you know. I had to really remind her that she's a distinguished research scientist, and this was a correlation. It wasn't his destiny, it was a correlation. In the same sense that, you know, there are lots of people who smoke and live a long time, even though smoking is not a good thing, and on the whole, people, etc. So yes, I mean, these caveats are enormously important, but let me tell you now really why I think that the tension you feel, I don't feel. I don't feel the tension because I think the important thing that reconciles on the one hand, this relative stability of the life trajectory with the optimistic message that change is possible, change is relatively easy, much easier than we have believed, because there are cognitive skills that are relatively easy to learn and to implement, and that this is particularly easy to do early in life, it's easy to do reasonably in adolescence, and it's even reasonably easy to do later in life because there's increasing evidence of brain plasticity that is surprisingly more than had been believed. So it's possible to have quite stable trajectories and still to have ways in which individuals can use their different modes of thinking and of representing the stimulus and various kinds of plans and various kinds of distancing procedures and so on that can hugely change their ability to deal with their specific hotspots. That's a very important clinical message. I mean, that's a message that says, even though, for example, let me give you an example of what I think is the most interesting piece of the whole research program. It's not what we did at Stanford, it's what we did in the last 20 years in the South Bronx. And what we did in the last 20 years in the South Bronx is to show that kids who are able to have executive function are able, as a result of having that skill, to protect themselves against the playing out of whatever dispositions, traits, if you will, that they may be characterized by initially and genetically. For example, kids who are highly prone to aggression are going to be less violently aggressive if they have self-control skills. They'll still be aggressive, but they're not going to be the ones who are hitting the counselor over the head with a flashlight and giving her a concussion. That's very good news, because it means that if you increase the self-control skills of people who have strong dispositional vulnerabilities, it has a protective effect that to me is far more interesting than the predictive effects. And the protective effects really mean that those predictions don't have to play out, that individuals have the potential to change if they acquire the skill sets that are needed to regulate their reactions to their specific hotspots. So I hope this doesn't sound too abstract. I think it's very concrete.
Well, I mean, there's something fascinating going on here. I mean, in a correlation, a simple way of thinking about a correlation is there are 4 cells. So it can be high on both traits or low on both traits, or high on one and low on the other, and so on. And normally, the emphasis when you describe a correlation is on the high and the low. And you seem to be fascinated by the high-low and by the low-high. And that was true in your personality book, the 1968 book. This is what I see. So there are 2 characteristics that I find clearly different between you and me, for example. So you are much more interested in the deviant cells, and you're much more optimistic than I would be.
For sure.
So, by the way, it's easy, but yes, you are. So, so being pessimistic, I still, I want to give you trouble on this.
No, I understand.
That is, and because I feel trouble. That is, if it is so predicted.
It's not so predicted.
Good. Look, I mean, it is so much more predicted than we would expect.
I was surprised.
You were surprised that the field has been surprised. I mean, that's a major discovery. And there was a lot of irony, for the people in the field that it was Walter Mischel who was coming up with this, because it was from Walter Mischel we had learned that you shouldn't expect that much consistency. So that's
except that even in '68, I had said except for cognitive competencies.
And you view self-control as a cognitive competency.
Yes, and that's, I think, a very different view of something like willpower. If you think of it as a cognitive competence, it can be taught, it can be learned, and the challenges become exactly what the book is about, which are what are the kinds of skill sets, what are the kinds of parenting, what are the kinds of schooling, what are the public policy implications of what's learned about what is needed to nurture and to facilitate the development of executive control skills in kids. And
but surely there are individual differences. I mean, is there a heritable component?
Absolutely. There's no question that there's a genetic component, and there's no question that the genetic component is continuously interacting with the environmental component. And the point that I want to emphasize, though, is that the environmental component includes the individual as the agent. The individual as the agent is part of the environment. So because I think in our explanations of human nature, we have, for a very, very long time, put the causation everywhere except in the potential freedom of the individual to actually change what he or she does. So it's been the unconscious, it's been evolution, it's been the environment, except for the person. It's been, all kinds of things. But my point is that all of these are surely contributors, but at the end of the causal chain, it's the individual who rings the bell. And I think it's very important to ring the bell often. That is, a life without marshmallows, or whatever it is that does it for you, would be a very unfortunate, unhappy life. But on the other hand, a life without the skills to delay when you want to and need to would be a life in which you don't have choice. The whole point, I think, of what I'm pushing for in our discussion, and that I tried to make very clear in the book, is that self-control gives us the ability to make a genuine choice. Do I want this damn thing or don't I? But if I do, I want to be able to get it. So it is this argument really for the potential for freedom and choice, which people don't have if they're deprived of this very fundamental kind of skill, which is a very important skill.
Well, this is really for the readers of the book, and I suppose that's everybody here, and not many people have read it already. You should be looking for that. You should be looking for the interplay between the stability and the possibility of change, and really the profoundly optimistic message that you have just delivered.
What I also want to add is that I take the genetic argument very, very seriously. And that's why I have a very serious chapter on is it prewired and the role of the DNA. And I'm certainly not a DNA expert. I know very little about it. I draw on it only from what I learned from colleagues and so on. But my understanding is that the way in which the environment influences what is expressed in the genome is enormously important, and that the conclusion that is coming out of research from people who really are expert in the DNA business is that it makes sense to have an analogy in which the DNA is like a gigantic library, and in that library are the genes, and which ones get activated and which ones don't get activated depend enormously on the environment, when the environment includes not only the stuff we eat and smoke and drink and so on, but also even the kinds of mental processes that we go through, the kinds of emotions we experience, whether or not we become depressed, etc. And that, therefore, the way in which we live, our wearing of rose-colored glasses or of depressed glasses, enormously influences what plays out in the DNA. And I think one of the great tools for having the better stuff play out is to have the kinds of self-control skills that are fundamental for giving us choice.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen any of this explained as clearly as it is in your book. And including with, the tension that you're free of and I'm not, acknowledging this duality between what is fixed and what is well, nothing is completely fixed.
Nothing is completely fixed.
Nothing is completely fixed. I mean, we certainly
because
agree on that.
in all the causal chain, we have to also include chance and random events.
That's right. So, as it turns out, I was telling myself, Walter has done the best work on both sides of this argument. I mean, both on the consistency side and on the change side. You have done both.
Yeah,
so,
being Jewish, one argues both sides.
You have, that's right. I mean, you've been very good at that. I wanted to ask you a few questions, actually. Those are marshmallows from now on. Can you tell us, how would you describe what's happened to you over this career? Has it been discrete moments, or has it been a very slow process of seeing a richer and deeper picture?
Well, I think for me, the discomfort that I had about the original being nursery school studies, the ones that are in the media, the Stanford studies, what worried me about them was that it was an elite sample, that it was the Stanford of the 1960s, which means that essentially all the participants were white, with perhaps 2 exceptions and 550 children. That the participants were invariably the children of Stanford faculty or of Stanford faculty or of Stanford graduate students, and the kinds of questions that I think would be asked, around nursery school, around kindergarten, is when did your father get his Nobel Prize? Which is not something that one is comfortable generalizing to. And that's why I felt certainly I'm not going to write a book from Stanford. I wanted to go back to the kinds of stuff I had seen in Trinidad, which is very different ethnicity, very different backgrounds, very different environments, and therefore that was really part of the motivation why I left, the Palo Alto paradise to come to Manhattan in 1983, when New York was not quite what it is today. And what drove me here really was because I wanted to do work in the South Bronx and had opportunities to do so here. And it's the South Bronx studies that convinced me that it is possible to have profound changes in how life plays out if we change the way in which we educate our children. And that's why my experiences, for example, with the KIPP schools and with Sesame Street and so on, all of which are from the recent years. So my answer to your question is there have been 2 phases to my career. The sunshine of Stanford, and the realities and complexities of New York.
And so you would say that the consistency, that's the Stanford period and the change.
Well, I mean, the Stanford period was the period of the '68 book, which said there is very little consistency. Yeah. The Columbia period has been the period in which I say, yeah, there is very little consistency. There are some relatively stable over time patterns, but not cross-situational consistency. We do have the vulnerability to the interns or to the junk food or the whatever, and therefore regularly see the headlines that tell us that people who are sensational at attention control, like Tiger Woods, also have, you know, other aspects to their lives that are a surprise, but not to me.
Walter, one aspect of your work that I found as a professional psychologist really exciting is the number of collaborations that you have had with students is extraordinary. And those are very, what is your secret?
Well, I mean, I think I'm still answering the question you're asking about phases of careers and so on. I think that I'm a very collaborative person, and I don't really know how to do research all alone. I don't know how to do anything all alone. I like to connect. And I think that what's been wonderful is that in the last 20 years, psychology has really gone through a tremendous transformation by connecting with neuroscience, by connecting with genetics, by connecting with economics, and that this has led to wonderful collaborations. I mean, one that I'm in right now is with people at Harvard who are economists and who are bringing a rigor to follow-up studies that's wonderful, that try to be a little more sensitive and careful in explaining what correlations are and what correlations aren't and so on, and that are trying to look at economic outcomes as the, quote, kids are now in their mid-50s.
You have, among other things that your book is, and it's many things, it's also a self-help book. I mean, you know,
yes,
nakedly a self-help book. What's your favorite self-help advice? You give a lot, but if you had to pick one, what would it be?
For myself?
I don't want to intrude.
Yeah. I think that one of the really important self-help things involves distancing techniques. I saw the distancing, and I tried to show it here, you know, where the kids are literally, the delayers are shoving the goodies away, shoving the bell away, get away from me, get away from me. I think, and this is stuff you touch on in your book also in financial decision making, it's very important to have a way of distancing from yourself. Now, it's one thing to distance from marshmallows and a bell. It's another thing to distance from your emotions without being schizophrenic. I mean, how do you distance from it? But you can. For example, if one is in a rejection situation, if one has been heartbroken, deserted by a partner, left really heartbroken, and is having trouble getting over that heartbreak. And each time you review the terrible thing that happened to you, your heart breaks some more. And instead of healing, you're hurting more, and you're opening the wounds and you're not allowing them to close, which is I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and so this is a situation that's not uncommon. Therapists typically ask the why question, but they ask the why question directly from you, okay? What we found in research, collaborative research again, is that if the why question is asked not through your own eyes, but where you are looking at yourself and the person who broke your heart, like a fly on the wall is observing it, you are getting an opportunity to look at it in a cooler way, in a more distanced way, so that allows greater empathy for the other person, a way of seeing how it looked to the other, a way of not simply reopening the same wound. So I think what is not realized, often self-control sounds like a formula for a really miserable life. You know, postpone everything, delay everything, enjoy nothing. I mean, it sounds terrible. I mean, why would one want to live like that? I mean, it seems to me that it's crucially important to understand that ringing the bell and taking the stuff, if you like it, is as important as knowing how to not do that. So that's why I keep, again, emphasizing choice and freedom to make the decision. So this distancing business is, I think, very good, a way of stepping out of yourself, being a fly on the wall, even not thinking in the first person, not thinking I, but thinking there's Walter and somebody. Okay? That, I think, is very useful, and I suspect that it's very useful and sensible financial decision-making also.
Yes, definitely. Let me turn for a few minutes to questions from the audience. Well, this is a question you've answered. Can there be harm to too much self-control?
A lot.
So, and here, do you think the technology will influence the child's ability to develop attentional control? And if so, how can we compensate for the interference of technology with self-control?
Well, I mean, my lessons on that come from watching my grandchildren. And my grandchildren, or at least one of them, who's actually in the audience, so I have to be very careful. I mean, the guy is constantly on his things, you know. And
I think
and
most
you
guys
know,
are.
for a long time, I thought, you know, he's doomed because, you know, how can... but he actually turns out not to be doomed. I mean, he learns an enormous amount from this stuff, and I realize that attention regulation, attention control, and so on is enormously facilitated by some of these procedures. I'm saying, yeah, there are more immediate temptations around, and we can get to them faster. And I realize, all of us, I mean, I find myself becoming impatient if it takes 8 seconds for Google to open up.
Yeah.
So certainly the enormous availability of all this stuff is making me, at least, a lot more impatient and having a lot of problems I didn't have before, which is, you know, before I would only wait for the mail to arrive once in the afternoon. Now I'm doing email regularly and looking what's out there. So yeah, there are endless temptations, but there are also wonderful ways in which kids particularly, I mean, 4-year-olds do better on the iPhone than I do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're old. Let's face it. Is there any correlation between children who have less trust for whatever reason and executive function? What's the
Well, I mean, there's certainly one of the things that I did before doing any marshmallow experiments is to study trust very, very carefully. I spent at least 5 years studying trust. Now trust has been rediscovered as very important. Yes, it's immensely important. You don't trust the promise maker, you don't wait for the promise. Parents want to have children who delay gratification, they better keep their promises. I mean, of course, trust is immensely important, but trust is not the same thing as executive function skills. Even if you have executive function skills, you're not going to use them if you don't trust the environment or you don't trust the promise maker. There are many times when you shouldn't delay gratification, for example, when there's severe inflation.
How does parenting factor into self-control?
Very important.
Stricter parent is more self-control in the child or less?
A stricter?
Yeah, a strict parent. What's the correlation between strict parenting and child self-control?
It's a very good,
question.
A very good question. I have a very interesting section that's called "What If You Had a Mother Like Portnoy Had?" For those of you who have read Portnoy's Complaint, anyone?
Yeah,
okay.
Many.
The over-controlling mother, who is hugely sensitive to her own needs and quite blind to the needs of her child, is going to have some issues when it comes to the development of good self-control skills in her children. If we had another 2 hours, I'd be glad to talk about it, but it's a very complex set of issues that are very interesting, actually. I'll say just a little bit about it, if I may. We already see very interesting connections between what toddlers do when they're 18 months old at the Barnard Toddler Center and what they do when we test them 2.5 years later on the so-called marshmallow test. And when the mother is a reasonably not over-controlling mother and the attachment relationship is reasonably good, then we can see that the kids who were able, during a mother's brief absence during the strange situation in toddlerhood, this is a situation where mom goes out of the room for 2 minutes while the toddler is left with a college student. It's called the strange situation. And you see some children are gnawing at the doorknob, you know, and kicking the door and so on, and other children are able to distract themselves and to use the toys in the room to kind of wait for mom to come back. And this is already predicting how well they're going to do on the marshmallow test, except if they have a mother like Portnoy had. If they had a mother like Portnoy had, they're much better, you know, it's a different story. So it's a very complex story. But the answer to this very interesting question is, yes, the relationship, the attachment relationship is very important in influencing what happens in how self-control plays out.
Dr. Mischel, did many children eat all 3 marshmallows?
The only person that I've seen eat all 3, okay, was Mr. Stephen Colbert on the Colbert Show. In children, you know, I've not seen the eating of the 3, but I've seen something very interesting, which happened actually in a study that we did in Chile, South America. And this was a child who had chosen Oreo cookies. He was 6 years old. And he was fantastic because what he did, not knowing he was being observed, was to open each Oreo cookie and to completely, carefully lick out the contents. He then completely replaced the 2 halves and placed them exactly in the positions that they were on the tray. He then struck a position of total innocence as he looked at the door, okay, for the return of the experimenter, okay? And when I showed that video at Columbia University in a university lecture, the provost at the time yelled out, "Give that guy a fellowship when he comes here."
Especially to the business school?
Yeah, especially in the business school.
We could go on a long time, but I think we're done. Thank you, Walter.
Thank you, Daniel.